On the evening of June 10th, 1986, Sue Snow climbed into her backyard hot tub in a small suburb outside of Seattle, Washington. The water felt amazing, so Sue told her two daughters to come join her. The girls came over and jumped in the hot tub with their mom, and immediately they began laughing and splashing each other. And right away, it reminded Sue of when her daughters were actually really young. In reality, her daughters were not little kids anymore. Her oldest was home from college for summer, and her youngest was already 15 and would head up to college herself in a couple of years. So as a result, Sue cherished moments like this, when life just sort of felt simple again. And tonight actually felt even more special than normal because Sue had actually been so busy at work lately that she'd barely gotten to see her girls at all. Sue was a vice president at a bank, and she had just landed a $5 million account that afternoon. This was a huge accomplishment, but it had taken a toll, with lots of late nights and very stressful meetings. Just then, Sue's husband, Paul Webking, came outside with some soda and champagne, and Sue looked up at him with surprise. Paul grinned, handed the soda to the girls, and poured Sue a glass of champagne. Then he raised his own glass to make a toast. He said he knew Sue didn't like to talk about her accomplishments, but he was so proud of her, and she deserved to be celebrated for closing such a huge deal at work. The girls cheered, and Paul leaned in to give Sue a kiss. Sue smiled, and she knew that if right now somebody took a picture of this moment, she and Paul would look like the perfect couple. But the truth was, their relationship had been strained for quite a while. 9 months ago, Paul had made a terrible confession. He'd cheated on Sue with an old girlfriend. He swore it only happened once and that it didn't mean anything, but Sue had been absolutely crushed. At the time this happened, she and Paul had been together for 8 years. They were talking about getting married, and Paul looked after Sue's daughters like they were his own, and so Sue wasn't ready to throw all of that away. So they'd started couples counseling, and just 2 months after Paul's confession, they had an impromptu wedding. Sue hoped this marriage would actually fix their relationship. But truthfully, Sue had never been able to shake the fear that Paul's cheating had not stopped. Paul was a long-haul trucker, which meant he spent days and days at a time on the road. And ever since he confessed to cheating on her, Sue spent the entire time he was gone wondering who he was with. The sound of her daughter's laughter stopped Sue from spiraling further into these intrusive thoughts about her husband, and her attention snapped back to her family. They spent the evening talking and laughing together, and Sue reminded herself to focus on all the positive things she had in her life. And by the time she climbed out of that hot tub that night, she actually was in a good mood again. But the next morning, Sue woke up with a pounding headache. Unfortunately, the stress from work and her constant concerns about Paul had made these morning headaches all too common. Paul had already left for work, and her oldest daughter had spent the night out with her boyfriend. So Sue rolled out of bed and walked down the hall to say good morning to her youngest daughter, Haley, and then after that, she went right to the medicine cabinet in her bathroom. She grabbed a bottle of extra-strength Excedrin and washed down 2 pills with water from the sink, hoping this would get rid of her headache. A little later that morning, Haley stepped out of the shower in the other bathroom. She wrapped her towel around herself and then opened the door to go back to her bedroom. But she heard something strange. The water in her mom's bathroom sink was running, and she thought she heard water splashing onto the floor. Haley called out for her mother, but she didn't get an answer. So Haley walked down the hallway, and as she did, the sound of running water got louder, but she couldn't hear her mom moving around or anything. Haley approached her mother's bathroom door, which was slightly open, and through the crack, she saw that the tap water was on and the sink was overflowing with water. Haley rushed in to turn off the water, but then she saw something on the ground and she just screamed. Her mother was crumpled on the floor in her bathrobe with her back up against the bathtub. Sue's eyes were wide open and her fingers were curled up like she was trying to grip something that wasn't there. And so after a second of screaming, Haley stopped and bent down and checked her mother's pulse because she couldn't tell if she was even alive. And she found her mother's pulse was there, but it was faint. In a total panic now, Haley turned off the water and then ran to the phone in her mother's room, but she wasn't really thinking clearly, so instead of immediately calling 911, she called her mother's friend. When the friend heard what was going on, she told Haley to call 911 right now, and the friend said she'd be over in a second. A few minutes later, the friend and the paramedics arrived, and Haley, who was totally upset, led them all to the bathroom where her mother was. The paramedics quickly examined Sue and began pulling off her robe to check for hidden injuries, and as they did, one of them asked Haley if her mother had a history of drug use. And Haley shook her head and said no, she sometimes took over-the-counter drugs, but that was it. Meanwhile, Sue, despite having a light pulse, was still completely unresponsive. and so the paramedics put a tube down her throat, they lifted her onto a stretcher, and then ran with her back through the house out the front door, with Haley and her mom's friend following behind. The paramedics loaded Sue into the back of the ambulance and told Haley that her mom would need to be airlifted from the local hospital to a bigger hospital in Seattle, and Haley would need to find her own way there. Then they shut the ambulance doors and sped off with the sirens blaring. Haley stood in her front yard in a total daze. Her mother's friend put her hand on Haley's arm and told her she would drive her to the hospital, and she also asked Haley if there was anyone else she could call. And that was the first time since Haley found her mother on the bathroom floor that she thought of her mom's husband, Paul. Paul was loading his 16-wheeler truck in the back of a big industrial warehouse when one of his coworkers came over to him looking panicked. The coworker said Sue's friend had just called dispatch and told them that Sue had been rushed to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. Paul immediately put the box he was holding down and asked his coworker, what else do you know? What else did Sue's friend say? But the coworker just shrugged. Sue's friend hadn't given any more details than that. So Paul gave up on loading his truck and just ran out to his own car and began driving towards the city. But as he drove, he was more confused than worried about Sue. He knew that lately she'd been having a lot of anxiety, and since Sue's friend had not mentioned a car accident or any kind of big injury, Paul kind of assumed that Sue might just be having a big panic attack. But 15 minutes later, Paul walked through the doors of the emergency room and he saw Haley's pale face, and he knew that whatever happened to her mother was not just a panic attack. Paul asked Haley what was happening, and she blurted out, "Mom's brain dead," and then she began crying. Paul stared at Haley in shock. This didn't make any sense. When he left that morning, Sue was in bed sleeping peacefully, totally fine. But Haley obviously knew more than he did, and she was hysterical, and so with a sinking feeling, Paul realized something horrible was really happening. This was real. And so as his heart rate sped up, he tried to catch his breath, and then he just pulled Haley in tight for a hug. A few minutes later, Paul tracked down the doctor outside of Sue's room in the intensive care unit, but the doctor didn't have much more information than Haley did. He said that unfortunately, Sue's brain had been starved of oxygen for so long that she would never wake up again. But he said the medical staff could not figure out why. Essentially, Sue was a healthy 40-year-old woman, except for the fact that she was now suddenly brain dead. Then, in a soft, comforting voice, the doctor said now there was only one thing left to do. Paul was going to have to decide when to take Sue off of life support and let her die. Paul just stood there staring at the doctor like he couldn't even process what he was just being told. And then finally, he just asked the doctor if he could please go see his wife. The doctor nodded, and as Paul walked into Sue's room and saw her laying there connected to all these tubes and wires, he wondered how in the world he was going to find the strength to make this terrible choice. One day later, the medical examiner put on a pair of rubber gloves and walked up to the metal table that held Sue's body. Paul had waited until Sue's older daughter could make it to the hospital to say her goodbye to her mother before Paul gave the doctors permission to take Sue off of life support. And so now, the medical examiner had to solve the mystery of why this seemingly healthy woman had suddenly collapsed and died just 5 hours later. An assistant took notes as the medical examiner narrated her findings, but she was as baffled as the hospital staff. Sue had not had a stroke, aneurysm, or a heart attack. She had no broken bones, no skull fractures, and no internal bleeding. And a drug panel showed she had not overdosed on any of the more common street drugs like heroin or cocaine. So the medical examiner began to think that her only hope of solving this mystery would likely come from the full toxicology report, which would take several more days to complete. But then suddenly, the medical examiner's assistant stopped taking notes and interrupted the medical examiner mid-sentence. The assistant asked if the medical examiner smelled something strange. The medical examiner shook her head and looked at her assistant confused. The assistant wrinkled up her nose and took in a big inhale, and then nodded with certainty like, "Yup, I smell something." So the medical examiner did the same thing and breathed in deep through her nose, and immediately her eyes went wide. The odor was faint, but it was very clear. Sue's body definitely smelled like almonds. In all her years of performing autopsies, this medical examiner had never seen this before. And so even though she now had a theory as to what happened to Sue, she was already kind of questioning whether that could possibly be true. I mean, this only ever happened in movies or detective novels. But she still made a special note to check for one more chemical on Sue's toxicology report, because cyanide has a telltale smell: almonds. 5 days after the medical examiner sent Sue's blood off to be tested, Detective Mike Dunbar from the local police department was about to pop some bread in the toaster for breakfast when his phone rang. Dunbar answered, and his sergeant quickly told him to cancel whatever plans he had that day because he was catching a new case. A woman named Sue Snow had been murdered, and before Dunbar could say anything, his sergeant said her toxicology report showed that Sue had been poisoned with cyanide. Dunbar was so shocked he had to ask the sergeant to repeat himself to make sure he heard correctly. Any murder in the quiet Seattle suburb where Sue lived was totally unusual, but cyanide poisoning sounded like something out of a movie. But the sergeant said, yep, there's no doubt about it, it was cyanide. He said the medical examiner and her assistant had smelled almonds during Sue's autopsy, which is a sign that perhaps this was cyanide, and then sure enough, when they sent off her blood, it came back positive for cyanide. Sue had a lethal dose in her system. The sergeant reminded Dunbar that cyanide was a fast-acting poison, and there wouldn't have been more than a few minutes between when Sue ingested it and when she collapsed. That meant that Sue must have come into contact with whatever poisoned her inside of her house, because she collapsed in her bathroom. So the sergeant gave Dunbar the family's phone number, and then the two hung up, and then Dunbar immediately called the family's house. After a few rings, Paul picked up with a very distracted-sounding hello. Dunbar introduced himself, but Paul barely seemed able to hear him. And then eventually, Paul actually just cut Dunbar off and apologized and said, I can't talk right now because I'm about to leave for Sue's burial. But Dunbar told Paul that unfortunately, the news he had could not wait. He told Paul Sue had been poisoned, and Dunbar needed to come to their home as soon as possible to look for whatever had killed her because it could still be in that house, which means the family could still be at risk. Paul was completely silent for a minute, and then he told the detective that, that's shocking, but still he would need to talk to him later on because of this burial. So Dunbar kind of resigned to the fact that Paul was not going to budge on this, told Paul to please gather Sue's family at his house after the burial, and Dunbar said he would come by to talk to them and also search the place to make sure there was no more poison in their house. At this, Paul just kind of mumbled that he'd do his best, and then he hung up. Later that day, Detective Dunbar arrived at Sue and Paul's house, and when he got there, he saw the other detective who was going to help him with the search of the house. Then the two of them walked up to the front door, and Dunbar knocked on the door, and as they waited, Dunbar turned to his colleague and warned them that the family had just come back from Sue's burial, so the mood was going to be very sad and heavy. However, when Paul opened the door, upbeat music was blasting from the stereo, and Dunbar could hear people laughing inside the house. Paul smiled and welcomed the two detectives inside, and he told them that instead of having a gloomy wake, he decided to hold a celebration of Sue's life. He said being sad and crying really didn't help with anything. Dunbar nodded politely, but he shared a quick, suspicious look with the other detective. This was not what either of them had expected at all. Paul pointed them to the bathroom where Sue had died, and he told the detectives that the family had not touched anything inside of there at all. Dunbar then gave Paul a form asking for consent to search the house, and Paul signed it right away. But before the detectives got started, Paul told them he had one question. Dunbar nodded and looked at him intently, curious to hear what this question was. Paul then held up a menu and said he was ordering pizza, and his question was, "Do you want any pizza?" Dunbar knew people grieved in different ways, but he could not get over how relaxed Paul seemed. But he thanked Paul for the offer and said no, they didn't want any pizza, and then they headed down the hall towards the bathroom. Dunbar put on rubber gloves and then stepped into Sue's bathroom and went right for the medicine cabinet. One by one, he took out bottles of prescription medication and over-the-counter pain pills and carefully dropped each one into its own evidence bag. As Dunbar worked, the other detectives searched the rest of the house, looking for anything stored in the closets or garage that in theory could contain cyanide. When Dunbar finally finished in the bathroom, he walked back to the kitchen and he found Paul sitting quietly at the table. By now, most of the guests had left and the music had been shut off and the pizza was getting cold on the counter. Paul seemed to have lost all the energy he'd had when Dunbar and his colleague had first arrived. Dunbar saw an opportunity here, and so he sat down and just began asking Paul questions about where he had been and what he was doing on the morning Sue had died. Paul told Dunbar that he'd left for work before Sue had woken up, and then later that morning, he learned that his stepdaughter, Haley, had found Sue on the bathroom floor. Paul's voice sounded very tired, and his story was very to the point, without any of the extra details that could sometimes indicate a person was making things up. Dunbar wondered if maybe he'd misjudged Paul. Maybe Paul's oddly excited demeanor from earlier was really just his attempt to cope with overwhelming grief and shock. Of course, Paul might also have realized he'd made a very bad first impression on the police, and so maybe now he was just trying to backpedal and act really upset, like the way they would expect him to. So Dunbar wasn't really sure what to make of Paul. After asking Paul a few more questions and feeling satisfied that Paul had told him everything he knew, Dunbar thanked Paul and then excused himself to go talk to Sue's daughters and the other family members who were still in the house. But when he spoke to them, they all seemed totally drained, and none of them really had anything new to share. And so at this point, Dunbar understood that really there was only so much progress he could make without knowing what exactly had poisoned Sue. So he and the other detective thanked the family, they gathered up all their bags of evidence and left to go turn in everything they had found to the lab. At 8 p.m. that night, Detective Dunbar was back at home relaxing by himself when his phone rang. It was a scientist from the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA for short, which is the government agency responsible for ensuring that food and medicines are safe. Dunbar had sent all that evidence he collected at Sue's home to the FDA for testing, but he definitely had not expected a callback so quickly. The FDA scientist told him on the phone that this was a very urgent matter. They had found the source of the cyanide. It was in the Excedrin painkillers inside of Sue's medicine cabinet that she was taking for her headaches. Someone had replaced the powder-filled Excedrin gel caps with gel caps that were filled with cyanide powder. Of the 56 pills that were still inside of the bottle, 7 more contained cyanide. And suddenly, Dunbar knew exactly why the FDA had 1, tested everything so quickly, and 2, reached out to him right away. The implications of these pain pills containing the cyanide was that perhaps Sue was not like a targeted killing. Perhaps the murderer or murderers walked into a pharmacy or multiple pharmacies and just slipped poison pills in with the over-the-counter pain medication. And if that's what happened, there was no way to know if just 1 bottle had been poisoned, or if there were more poison pills out there, either still waiting on store shelves or in unsuspecting people's medicine cabinets. Like, this could be a full-blown national emergency. And this was actually not the first time something like this had happened before. Just 4 years earlier in Chicago, Illinois, 7 people had died after taking cyanide-laced Tylenol they bought in their local pharmacies and grocery stores. When news of the deaths had broken, there was a national panic, and despite the intense investigation that followed the Chicago Tylenol murders, the killer had never been caught. Now, Detective Dunbar realized that the Tylenol killer may have just struck again, or he could be dealing with a copycat killer. Either way, if this killer really was murdering at random through these poison medication bottles, well, figuring out their identity would be very difficult, if not impossible. Dunbar thanked the FDA scientist and hung up. Then he immediately called the chief of police and let him know they might have a large-scale incident on their hands. The city was going to have to put up some kind of an alert. But even though Dunbar realized this case could be on the scale of the infamous Tylenol murders, he wasn't totally convinced that somebody had tampered with Sue's Excedrin in a store. The more simple explanation was that this was not a random murder, that somebody who knew Sue, who had a reason to kill Sue, specifically put cyanide pills in with her Excedrin pills. And if that was the case, Dunbar thought Sue's husband Paul was the most likely suspect. So Dunbar called Paul and told him that it turns out it was specifically the Excedrin that had killed Sue. That's where the cyanide was. And in a calm voice, Paul replied to this by saying that he was not surprised. Dunbar was so shocked by Paul's answer that he just kind of fell silent for a second. He couldn't understand how Paul could have thought the Excedrin was poisoned unless he was the one who poisoned it. Then suddenly, Paul began stammering, and he told the detective that, oh my goodness, I've taken 2 of those exact Excedrin pills myself. I could have died. And then Paul began to hyperventilate over the phone. But the whole thing felt a little too theatrical for Dunbar. For Paul to go from not even being surprised about the Excedrin to suddenly panicking that he could have been a victim himself just felt very performative. So Dunbar asked Paul if anyone had seen him take those Excedrin pills. If this really was Paul's story, Dunbar wanted him to prove it. But Paul, who was still hyperventilating, said no, he was alone when he took the pills. However, this only added to Dunbar's suspicion of Paul. The next morning, when Dunbar grabbed his newspaper off his porch and read the headlines, he grimaced. There on the front page in big letters was the announcement that Excedrin had been recalled across the entire country. Dunbar knew the recall was the right thing to do, but he also thought this was going to spark public hysteria. And when he arrived at the police station later that day, he knew he was right. The station was absolute chaos, with a line of people at the desk. Some of them were yelling out their theories, and others were crying because they were worried they'd taken poisoned Excedrin, even though if they had, they'd already be dead. But they didn't really know that, so they were just totally losing their minds about it. But it wasn't just civilians that were clogging up the police station hallways. An entire busload of FBI agents had descended, and Dunbar watched them setting up a command post in a big conference room. Dunbar pushed his way through the crowd of hysterical people and made his way to his desk, where he found a special agent named Ike Nakamoto waiting for him. Nakamoto was a big, serious-looking guy, but the moment he saw Dunbar, he smiled and shook Dunbar's hand and apologized for the mess. Dunbar had heard stories about how the FBI liked to order local police around, and so he was immediately suspicious of Nakamoto's friendliness. Nakamoto explained that the FBI had been called in as soon as the FDA realized it was the Excedrin that was poisoned. He said that after the Chicago Tylenol murders, the FBI had been given jurisdiction over any investigations that involved poisoned medication. But Nakamoto assured Dunbar that the FBI was there to focus on the product tampering angle, not to take Dunbar's murder case away. Nakamoto said he wanted the detective to continue to investigate Sue's death, and they could even work together and share information. Dunbar managed to smile and said he'd be happy to work together, but he said he still thought the killer was much more likely to be Sue's husband, Paul, than some anonymous poisoner. Paul just seemed off. It was like he was always either underreacting or overreacting, like a guilty man trying to say and do the right thing, rather than an innocent, grieving man reacting to events as they happened. It all just seemed very performative. Paul just kind of seemed like he was acting. And to Dunbar's surprise, Nakamoto nodded and agreed with him. The FBI was discussing all the possibilities, including the idea that, perhaps the Chicago Tylenol murderer had struck again, but they also thought, a local killer here was much more likely. Nakamoto said the FBI was only here to make sure nothing got missed. All day long, FBI agents flooded local pharmacies and grocery stores, taking more than 15,000 bottles of Excedrin off shelves and out of storage rooms and sending them out for testing. And while that was happening, people kept filing into the police station looking for answers. But by the evening, things had finally quieted down around town and at the station, and Detective Dunbar was exhausted and ready to go home. So he picked up his car keys and headed for the door, but right as he was about to leave, Nakamoto stepped out of the room the FBI had taken over and yelled for him to wait. Then Nakamoto rushed over to Dunbar and told him the FBI had just gotten a call from the lab, and they had found another cyanide-laced bottle of Excedrin at a grocery store. Dunbar just hung his head. This meant somebody was almost certainly poisoning medicine at random, likely in the pharmacies or in the grocery store, and this also meant Paul was not nearly as obvious a suspect as Dunbar thought. Now, the killer could be anyone. The next morning, Dunbar arrived back at the police station, thinking his role in the investigation was over. It seemed pretty clear that the killer was poisoning bottles at random, which was way beyond anything Dunbar or his small police department had the resources to handle. But as a team of FBI agents headed out the door to interview people at the grocery store where that second tainted bottle was found, Special Agent Nakamoto approached Dunbar and told him he wanted to keep their two parallel investigations running. Nakamoto said the second bottle could just be a decoy, so the FBI would pursue the theory that the killer was a random poisoner, but Dunbar should keep his investigation alive, looking into Sue's life, in case the killer was connected to her. Dunbar felt rejuvenated, and the first thing he did was head right to the bank where Sue worked. He still wasn't sure what to make of Paul, and so he figured maybe Sue's co-workers could give him a fresh angle to pursue. Dunbar walked into the bank, and the atmosphere was quiet and stuffy. He worried that Sue's co-workers might not open up. But he asked a woman working behind one of the desks if she'd be willing to answer some questions about Sue, and the woman's face lit up. She immediately grabbed Dunbar's arm, pulled him into an empty office, and began gossiping like they were old friends. She said that Sue was very flirtatious and had a hot temper. One time, somebody Sue went to lunch with had even left an angry note on Sue's desk afterward, accusing her of being promiscuous. Sue always claimed that her flirting was not cheating, but the coworker had always wondered if maybe Sue's behavior really bothered Paul. And she said there was more. People close to Sue knew Paul had cheated on Sue, and so they theorized that maybe all of Sue's flirting was Sue's way of getting back at Paul. Detective Dunbar thanked Sue's coworker, and then talked to a few more people at the bank, and then headed to the station to inform Nakamoto that Sue and Paul's marriage might have been way more strained than anybody realized. But when Dunbar got to the station, Nakamoto was waiting on the steps with 2 coffees in his hands. he handed one to Dunbar and told him he had big news. Now, most of the people who had called into the police station worried that they or their loved ones had been poisoned by Excedrin that was laced with cyanide were people who were just reacting to headlines and being paranoid. But it would turn out one of them was right. There had been another death from cyanide poisoning in town, and it happened 3 days before Sue's death. Nakamoto said the victim was a man named Bruce Nichol, and he had died suddenly of what doctors thought was emphysema, which is a very serious lung disease. But Bruce's wife, Stella, did not believe that because Bruce had never been diagnosed with emphysema. So a couple of days after Bruce's death, when Stella saw the news about Sue and the Excedrin, she called the FBI saying her husband had died very mysteriously not long before Sue, and so maybe he had died from cyanide. Now, by this point, her husband Bruce had actually already been buried, but he had donated his eyes. So a vial of Bruce's blood had been taken to determine blood type, and then that blood had been stored at the blood bank. So the FBI sent that blood out for testing, and it would turn out it was positive for cyanide. Detective Dunbar didn't know what to say. After his trip to the bank, he'd convinced himself all over again that Paul must have been Sue's killer, retaliating that she was flirting and potentially cheating on him. But Bruce Nichol's death would mean that Paul killed 2 people, one of them 3 days before Sue. And so Dunbar wanted to go talk to Bruce's wife, Stella, to see if maybe there was some connection between Bruce and Sue. But Nakamoto stopped him and reminded Dunbar that the tampering angle was the FBI's case, and so Nakamoto would interview Bruce's wife Stella, and then he would tell Dunbar what he learned. The next afternoon, Special Agent Nakamoto arrived at the mobile home where Stella and her daughter lived. Stella opened the door and invited him into a small room that was dominated by a huge fish tank. Nakamoto sat down on the couch and watched Stella's brightly colored exotic fish dart back and forth. Stella watched him and told him she actually had a dream of opening up an exotic fish store of her own someday. Nakamoto smiled and said the fish were beautiful. Then, in a gentle voice, he asked Stella to please tell him what happened to her husband. But Stella said there really wasn't much to tell. Bruce had gone outside on the deck to get some fresh air, and then suddenly he collapsed. She said he had just taken a handful of Excedrin, and usually he took 4 pills at once. Nakamoto nodded and then asked Stella if she remembered where and when these pills had been purchased. Stella said she didn't, but Bruce saved all their receipts for tax purposes. So she got up and then quickly returned with a small box full of receipts. She said Nakamoto might have to dig a little bit, but she was almost positive he would find the receipt he needed. And so Nakamoto took the box, thanked Stella for her time, and then headed out the door. But as he walked outside, Stella's daughter, Cindy, pulled up in her car and got out, and unlike Stella, Cindy was furious. Nakamoto wasn't even down the steps before Cindy launched into a tirade, saying she couldn't believe the police were here questioning her family, like they would never hurt Bruce. Nakamoto tried to explain that, her mother, and Cindy for that matter, were not being treated like suspects here, but Cindy just cut him off and went from being angry to kind of sounding really heartbroken, and she said Bruce had died right when his life seemed to be turning around. She said Bruce had been an alcoholic, but he'd gone to rehab, he'd stopped drinking, and things had never been better. And then Cindy dropped her head into her hands and looked like she was crying, and Nakamoto just said, "Look, I'm only here to ask everybody questions. That's how we're going to figure out who killed Bruce." But Cindy just continued to cry and said it just didn't seem fair. It's like everything had been going so well for him. How could this happen? Nakamoto just said how sorry he was, and he told Cindy he would find the person who did this. Over the next few days, Nakamoto and his team tried to track down the source of the cyanide that was used to poison the Excedrin to see if they could figure out where the killer purchased it. Even though cyanide is obviously deadly, it's actually widely available. It's used in photography, jewelry making, drug manufacturing, and lots of other industries. And so quickly, the FBI realized that trying to track this down was kind of a dead end. There were too many places it could have come from. Meanwhile, the public pressure to solve the case was only intensifying. A group of drug companies whose stock had tanked following the Tylenol murders, and now also these Excedrin murders, put up a $300,000 reward for any information that led to an arrest. To Nakamoto, it seemed like whoever had poisoned the Excedrin was likely a local who was familiar with the grocery stores in the area. So he didn't think the murders of Bruce and Sue were related to the Chicago Tylenol murders. But he was absolutely certain that whoever killed Bruce also killed Sue. because an FDA lab had confirmed that the cyanide used in both murders had clearly come from the exact same source, even though they couldn't actually identify what that source was. In both of the tainted capsules, there were these strange green flecks all mixed in with the poison, which made it impossible to identify who manufactured the cyanide, but it was unique enough that it meant this was the same batch of cyanide. So by the end of June, 3 weeks after Sue and Bruce had died, even though Nakamoto and Dunbar had made progress on their cases, it just kind of felt like every avenue they had pursued had led to a dead end, with regards to actually figuring out who did this. Dunbar still thought Paul was the best suspect, but there was absolutely no evidence that Paul had killed Sue, much less Bruce, and so both investigations began to drag, and several months went by with no new leads. Dunbar and Nakamoto were getting more and more frustrated because they had both worked almost non-stop on their parallel cases, and both basically had nothing to show for it. In December of 1986, 6 months after the murders, Special Agent Nakamoto heard another agent calling his name from across the FBI command center. He waved Nakamoto over to take the phone. Nakamoto headed across the room, and despite the other agent's obvious excitement, Nakamoto tempered his expectations. Over the past several months, countless people had called into the hotline, but most of those tips had gone nowhere. Nakamoto figured most people were calling in a desperate attempt to try to cash in on the $300,000 reward those drug companies had offered. And so Nakamoto grabbed the phone and introduced himself, and right away the caller said they knew who had killed both Sue Snow and Bruce Nichol. Nakamoto exhaled, expecting another long-winded theory that really had nothing to do with the case, but as this caller explained how they knew who the killer was, a stunned look came across Nakamoto's face. This caller pointed to evidence leading to the killer that had been right in front of investigators, but they had overlooked it. Nakamoto ended the call and quickly rallied his team. He wanted them to follow up on the details this caller had provided. At this point, Nakamoto was sure that he had just figured out who Sue and Bruce's killer was. On a summer day in 1986, the killer put on a pair of gloves and then poured a vial of powdered cyanide into a bowl. Then they reached into a bag and pulled out an empty gel capsule. They opened it up, and then using one end, they scooped up the cyanide powder and then took the other end and closed the capsule back up, sealing the poison inside. On the table in front of them were a row of untampered-with Excedrin bottles. The killer picked up one of them, carefully removed the safety seal and lid, and then shook one uncontaminated capsule out into their palm. They then held it up to the cyanide pill they had just made. No one would be able to tell the difference. After replacing the cyanide pill in the bottle they had just opened up, they did the same thing with the other bottles, basically taking out a handful of good pills and replacing them with more cyanide pills. When the killer was done, they carefully glued the plastic safety seals back onto all of these now tampered-with Excedrin bottles and put the lids back on them. Then the killer put those tainted bottles in a shopping bag and walked out to their car. The killer drove to a grocery store, went inside, and headed for the pharmacy aisle. Once they were there, they looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then they reached into their bag, pulled out a poisoned bottle of Excedrin, and placed it on the shelf with all the others. And it looked like it belonged there. Satisfied with their handiwork, the killer walked back outside. And then, just hours later, Sue Snow walked into that same grocery store and happened to buy that exact poisoned bottle of Excedrin that would kill her. But it would turn out the killer, who thought they had gotten away with it, had left behind one telltale clue. Those green flecks mixed in with the cyanide, the flecks that had baffled investigators and made it impossible to trace the source of the cyanide, well, it would turn out those flecks were dust from an algae pill used to keep the water clean in large fish tanks. And with that clue, Agent Nakamoto and his team came to realize that about a week before Sue ever stepped into that store, Stella Nichol had used tainted Excedrin to kill her husband, Bruce. Stella had crushed up the cyanide she had put in her husband's Excedrin in the same bowl she used to crush up the algae pills she used in her fish tank. And remnants of that algae showed up in samples of the tainted Excedrin. The tipster who had reached out to the FBI was Stella's own daughter, Cindy. It was Cindy who had at first insisted to Agent Nakamoto that nobody in her family would ever hurt Bruce, that they were the happiest they'd ever been since Bruce stopped drinking. But now, Cindy had a different story to tell. She said her mother, Stella, hated who Bruce had become after he quit drinking. Instead of getting dressed up and going to bars and hanging out with friends, Stella and Bruce now just stayed home all the time, and so Stella was bored. She missed her old life, and she felt like Bruce's new sobriety was holding her back. Cindy said Stella had even talked to her about how easy it would be to recreate the Chicago Tylenol murders and make it look like somebody had overdosed. Despite that, Cindy had tried to convince herself after Bruce's death that her mother's comments were just a weird coincidence. But then 6 months after the murders, Stella told Cindy she was going to use Bruce's life insurance money to live out her dream and open up a tropical fish store. And at this point, Cindy couldn't deny it anymore. She felt nearly certain that Stella must have killed Bruce for his money. Stella could have gotten away with this whole thing, but Bruce's autopsy didn't pick up the cyanide. Instead, the coroner listed Bruce's cause of death as emphysema. And that was actually a bad thing for Stella, because the life insurance policy she had on Bruce paid an extra $100,000 if his cause of death was accidental, i.e. cyanide, accidentally consumed cyanide, that's what she was hoping it would be, rather than emphysema, which is considered, a natural cause death, and so therefore would not be considered accidental. And so when Stella found out about this, she went back to the store with more cyanide pills because she needed another death, another cyanide death, to be able to have her own husband's cause of death reinvestigated. And Sue just happened to be the unfortunate victim who grabbed that bottle off the shelf that Stella had left. It would turn out Paul had nothing to do with Sue's murder. She was literally a random victim. Stella was arrested by the FBI and charged with 2 counts of causing death by product tampering. She was eventually found guilty and sentenced to 90 years in prison. Stella's daughter, Cindy, would receive $250,000 of that $300,000 reward the drug companies had offered. As for Sue's daughters, they received money in an out-of-court settlement with the drug manufacturer. They put it towards their college education, which is what they thought their mother would have wanted them to do. On the afternoon of October 16, 1991, a 36-year-old man named Enrique Martinez bent down, pulled out his pocket knife, and he carefully cut through the stem of a mushroom that was growing right next to a mossy log. And then after freeing this mushroom, he put it inside of his wicker basket with the other mushrooms he had collected in the area. And then Enrique stood up and just took a minute to take in the unbelievable view of this lush green valley right below him. Enrique was out mushroom hunting along with his wife Anna and their 2 friends, Jorge and Sofia, who were dating. And where they were mushroom hunting was near this old abandoned town called La Musara, which is located up in the mountains of northeastern Spain. It had been Jorge's idea to come to this area and explore. Jorge had heard all these crazy stories about La Musara, about how it was haunted, and there was all this creepy folklore surrounding this town. As for Enrique, he didn't really care about the lore surrounding this town. Frankly, the town was not that interesting to him. What was interesting was the opportunity to come out here and collect mushrooms. That was something he really liked to do. Enrique and his wife Anna lived in this very busy port city in Spain called Tarragona, and so their lives day to day were very hectic. Enrique, he worked at a bar as a bartender, and so every night he was surrounded by hundreds of people coming in and out. And so having a chance to come out here and be in nature at peace and collect these mushrooms just sounded too good to turn up. Enrique stopped staring at the valley right in front of him, and he turned around and continued to scan the mountainside for a particular type of mushroom that grew in this area. It was called the bloody milk cap, which was known to be great for grilling. It paired well with meat. And so Enrique's plan was to go out on this mushroom hunting trip, and when they got back, he wanted to cook a feast using these mushrooms for his wife and his friends. The group slowly made their way uphill until they finally saw the outskirts of the abandoned town, La Musara. La Musara was more than 900 years old, and now it was just a collection of crumbling ruins, some dating back to prehistoric times. La Musara had never been a big town. At its peak, it had about 300 residents. But the last of the remaining residents of this town had finally fled 40 years earlier, and so now it was a ghost town. The group made their way over to one of the buildings that was right on the outer perimeter of La Musara. It was basically just a foundation with 3 walls still standing. There was no roof. But the friends, they went over to this building, and from right next to it, they were able to look straight down the main drag of La Musara. It was basically just a dirt road that went straight out, and all along the road were other kind of ruined foundations of where buildings used to be. And fairly far down this road, maybe 200 feet away from where all the friends were standing, was the center of La Musara, which was marked by this big church with a huge steeple, and the church was actually in decent shape. It had not totally crumbled onto itself like the rest of the buildings around it. And then behind the church, somewhat visible from where the friends were standing, was this overgrown cemetery. And then kind of off to the side of the church was this pond that was also very overgrown, and it was full of croaking frogs. Enrique and his friends just stood there next to their dilapidated building, staring at La Musara in silence. Now, they knew this place was going to be very creepy. People had said it was haunted, and that was a big reason why Jorge wanted to come here. But now seeing it in person, really the creep factor was much higher than they expected. It really did look like a spooky place. And then adding to the spook factor was very clearly, as they were looking down this main road, the friends could see this mist kind of starting to envelop the town. Jorge had told the friends when he was doing his research about La Musara that the mist was really a trademark of this town. That at night, it basically got completely consumed in white mist. But now the friends are looking down this road, it's the middle of the day, and already the mist is starting to come in. Finally, Jorge broke the silence and said, "Hey, I want to show you guys something." And he grabbed his girlfriend Sophia's hand, and he began kind of jogging down the main road in the direction of the church. And so Enrique and Anna followed behind. And after only walking maybe 10 or 20 feet, Enrique happened to turn around and look back where they had just been standing next to this dilapidated building, and already he couldn't see that building because this fog had rolled in and totally obscured his view. Enrique couldn't help but feel a little uneasy, again, because he thought the fog was supposed to come in at night, and it's broad daylight, and here we are, totally covered in fog, but he shook it off, thinking, what's the big deal? And so Enrique turned back around, and he and Anna hustled to catch up with Jorge and Sofia, who by this point had stopped a little farther down the road, off to the side, where there was this strange rectangular rock that was maybe 2 feet tall, just kind of jutting up out of the ground. And when Enrique and Anna made it to Jorge and Sofia, Jorge placed his hand on the top of this strange rock, and looking very satisfied with himself, he would tell his friends, "This is the cyst stone, and people say it contains dark powers." The cyst stone was actually one of the oldest things in all of La Musara. Back in the day, Muslim armies used to march through La Musara, which actually got its name from this. La Musara means the place to march. And so these armies, as they would pass through La Musara, making their way to the valley down below, they would always stop at the cyst stone because they believed it had magical powers that could help them defeat their enemies in their upcoming battles. Now, the Muslim armies were long gone by this point, but the cyst stone was still there, and people still said that it contained that kind of magical power, that there were dark forces at work inside of the stone. And so to touch it was very risky. In fact, some people said if you touched the cyst stone, you could be sucked into this parallel world full of all these demonic entities. And so as Jorge told the group about all this history surrounding the cyst stone and how no one should touch it, remember, he's got his hands squarely on the cyst stone the whole time. And so when he finishes telling this story, he looks at the others and said, "Come on, somebody else touch it." Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, said, "Absolutely not. I'm not about to tempt evil spirits here." But Enrique's wife, Anna, said, "You know what? I'll touch it." And so Jorge smiled, he pulled his hand off the cyst stone, and Anna, she walked forward, she took a deep breath, and then she placed her hand on the stone. And for a second, the whole group just held their breath, like something was going to reach out and grab Anna and pull her into the stone, but nothing happened, and a minute later, Anna had pulled her hand off, and the whole group was laughing. But just a couple of seconds later, Enrique, who had been laughing along with the group, suddenly noticed that the frogs in the pond near the church, a little farther down the road from where they were suddenly so much louder. It was almost like when they touched the stone, it had maximized the volume of these frogs. And so Enrique, he turned his whole body and began staring down the road through the mist and fog at this pond, and he could kind of barely make it out. He was trying to see if there was something obvious causing these frogs to kind of go crazy. But as he stared at this pond, which again, he could barely see, right behind it was the church. But there was lots of fog kind of blocking the church. And for a second, the fog kind of parted, and Enrique got a full shot of one of the windows of this abandoned church. And in the window was this dark figure just standing there staring at Enrique and his friends. And Enrique, he sees this thing in the window, and in a second it was gone. And then the fog rolled back in, covered up the window, and Enrique couldn't see anything anymore. And so Enrique just stood there in stunned silence, having no idea if what he just saw had really just happened or if it was in his imagination or something. But before he could even try to process what had just happened, he heard his name being called. And so he kind of snapped out of it and he turned back to the group, and it was Anna, who was now jokingly saying, "Come on, Enrique, touch the stone too." Enrique quickly scanned Anna, Sofia, and Jorge's face, and they were all smiling and laughing still, and so clearly none of them had seen this figure in the window. And so Enrique, he kind of just looked at all of his friends, and then he looked back in the direction of the church and this window, which again he couldn't see because the fog was blocking it out. And so Enrique just tells himself, okay, there's no way that I just saw some dark figure moving around this abandoned church. That must have been my imagination. I'm totally fine. And so he turned back to his friends, and he could tell they were not going to let it go until he touched this stone. And so he said, fine, and he walked up and he touched the stone. And immediately, as soon as his hand made contact with that stone, everything seemed to change. The air around Enrique got cooler, and the stone itself started to warm up. And as this happened, Enrique, whose hand was still on the stone, began to think, wow, I could do this for hours. I could just stay here and leave my hand on the stone. This is amazing. But then somewhere buried deep in his mind, Enrique began telling himself, get away from the stone. Take your hand away. Get away right now. And so finally, Enrique did yank his hand away, and right away, all those feelings he was having as he touched the stone disappeared. The air went back to normal. He did not feel compelled to touch the stone, and he just kind of was left thinking, what just happened? And so Enrique's wife, Anna, along with Jorge, they were both grinning at Enrique, waiting for him to tell them about what it was like to touch the cistone. But behind them, Sofia, Jorge's girlfriend, she was not happy. She was the only one who had not touched the cistone. And so she spoke up and said, guys, let's get away from the cistone. I don't want to continue to tempt evil spirits, okay? Let's just go. And so Jorge threw his arm around Sofia and told her to lighten up, and then said, come on, let's do some more exploring. And so Jorge took Sofia's hand, and he continued walking down the main road in the direction of the church, and Enrique's wife, Anna, she quickly followed right after them, kind of running to keep up, like she was a kid who was excited about what they were doing. But Enrique, he just stayed put for an extra second, because even though he had told himself that, whatever he saw in the window was nothing, he could not help the fact that as soon as he touched that cistone, he felt different. There was something off about the stone, and really there seemed to be something off about this whole village, which by this point was now completely enveloped in fog. They were totally covered. Now, Enrique at this point did just want to leave La Musara. He didn't want to be there anymore. The place was totally creeping him out, but he didn't want to be a party pooper, and so he turned and continued walking down the main road after his friends and his wife. And after he walked a little ways, the fog parted enough that he could see the pond full of these very loud croaking frogs, as well as the church and that window where he had seen or supposedly seen this dark figure, but the window was empty. And Enrique was relieved to see that his friends clearly had not stopped at the church. They had not tried to go in. They had gone behind the church into the cemetery. Enrique did not want to go inside of the church because even though, again, he had told himself that, that figure wasn't real, it wasn't really in the window, still there was a part of him that wanted to stay far away from this building. But after Enrique walked past the pond and began side-skirting the church to get to the cemetery, he just stopped and turned and actually faced the window, kind of like involuntarily. He was looking at the window where this dark figure had been. And again, it's empty, there's nothing there. But Enrique felt like something was pulling him towards this window. And so without saying anything to his friends, who aren't really paying attention to Enrique, they're kind of just walking around the cemetery, Enrique walked right up to this window. He's right in front of it, he's looking inside, and now he can see into the actual church. And it's totally ruined inside, but he can see where the pews used to be on the ground, and he could also see where the pulpit used to be, where the priest would give mass. And as Enrique stood there staring into the church, he kept leaning closer and closer and closer into the church until finally he felt like he really wanted to move away and get away from the church, but it was like he couldn't. He just kept getting pulled into this opening. And then as this was happening, the sound of the frogs got louder and louder until Enrique felt like he was totally consumed by these frogs. Meanwhile, just around the corner of the church and back in the cemetery, Anna, Jorge, and Sofia were kind of laughing and walking around the cemetery, reading the different headstones, when at some point, Anna, Enrique's wife, just happened to look up when she realized Enrique was not there with them. And so Anna, she walked over to the gate of the cemetery and she looked up along the side of the church, and there was Enrique kind of leaning forward into this window looking into the church. And so Anna, she yelled out to him a couple of times, but Enrique did not even notice her or acknowledge her. He just continued leaning forward, looking in this window. And finally, Anna got right up next to Enrique and she actually shook his shoulder. And when she did that, Enrique kind of snapped out of it and turned and looked at her, but didn't say anything. He just had this totally confused look on his face. And Anna, she looks up at her husband and she's like, "Come on, come into the cemetery. That's where everyone is. Come on." And then Anna turned and skipped towards the cemetery. And once Anna was back in the cemetery, she just got right back to walking around and looking at all the different headstones. And at some point, as she was looking at one particular headstone, she took a few steps back to get a better look at it, and she accidentally bumped into another headstone, a big cross that had a line drawn across it, and it fell to the ground and it broke. Jorge and Sofia heard the sound of the stone breaking in half, and they turned and looked at Anna, and they kind of quickly understood what had happened. And Jorge, he just started laughing at her, and he said, "Oh boy, now you've upset the evil spirits in this town. You better put that back together." Now, Anna was trying to make light of this, but she was totally panicking and did not like the fact that she had just desecrated a gravesite in a potentially haunted town. And so she began picking up the headstone and trying to put the stone back on top, but it was no use. It was totally broken. And so as Anna continued to fumble with this headstone, and as Jorge continued to laugh and harass her about all the evil spirits that were going to attack her because of what she did, Jorge's girlfriend, Sofia, who was right next to him, she started getting on edge, and she said, "Hey, Jorge, is it true that this place is haunted? I mean, really, is this actually a haunted town? I mean, what's the deal?" And Jorge, at this point, he stops laughing at Anna, and he turns to Sofia, and he goes, "Yeah, I think this place really is haunted." And then he would tell them the story of how La Musara came to be known as a haunted town. Back in October of 1873, there was a civil war happening in this part of Spain. And one of the rival armies was using the caves in the mountainside kind of near La Musara as sort of makeshift field hospitals for their wounded. And one night, a very famous general named Cercos was wounded in battle. He was brought into one of these caves, and that was where he died. Now, Cercos was a beloved leader, and so the people inside of this cave really wanted to give him a proper burial, but they knew they had to keep his death a secret. Because if it got out to the rest of the men that their leader had died, it would be totally demoralizing, and it would really give their enemies a victory. And so the 6 people inside of this cave, they built a coffin and placed Cercos inside of it. And then early the next morning, when it was still dark out, these 6 carried the coffin with Cercos inside of it up into La Musara, and they buried him secretly in the cemetery behind the church. Weeks later, 5 armed rival soldiers climbed up the mountain into La Musara to look for General Cercos. They didn't know that he had died in that battle. In fact, really, besides those 6 people that saw him die and secretly buried him, nobody knew he was dead. And so these soldiers actually thought Cercos was hiding out in La Musara. And so these soldiers began busting into all the civilians' homes in La Musara and ripping them apart looking for this general, and they'd send the people out into the streets and tell them they're going to kill them unless they give up information about where this general is. And finally, after about an hour of this, an elderly man who lived in La Musara had just had enough, and he stepped forward and he told the rival soldiers that General Cercos was dead, that he was buried in the cemetery behind their church. But the rival soldiers didn't believe the man. They said, "Okay, show us proof." But the elderly man said, "Well, I don't know exactly where he was buried in the cemetery. I just heard that's where he was buried." And so the soldiers said, okay, get everybody over to the cemetery right now. And so all the townspeople made their way over to the cemetery, and the soldiers followed them. And then once they were there, the soldiers demanded that the townspeople begin basically digging up all the graves to find Serkos. And as the townspeople began to dig, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder, until finally the leader of these rival soldiers actually stepped away from all the chaos happening in the cemetery and walked over to the pond and began firing his gun into the water to get the frogs to stop. But they wouldn't. They actually only got louder and louder. And so the leader of these rival soldiers finally just gives up on trying to quiet down these frogs, and he turns around and walks back into the cemetery, and he finds all the townspeople have stopped digging. They basically dug up every grave, and they haven't found Serkos, and they're just kind of waiting to see what happens next. But the leader, as he looked across this graveyard, he noticed there was one grave that very conspicuously had not been touched. Everything around it had been dug up, but not this. No one had touched that grave. And so the leader said, go, dig that one up. But immediately the townspeople kind of took a step back and acted like, no way, we're not going near that grave. And so finally, a townsperson actually stepped forward and said to the leader of these rival soldiers that that grave contained this old woman who had died recently, who everyone suspected of being a witch. And so it was dangerous to try to dig her up. But the rival soldiers did not care at all about this. They just raised their guns and demanded the townspeople dig that grave up immediately. And so they would. They would go over, they would unearth this coffin, and then the rival soldiers would pop open the lid. And as soon as it was open, everybody went silent. Because this woman, who had died weeks earlier, looked totally preserved. She was laying on her back, and her skin was very pale, but it had not begun to rot yet. Even her cheeks still had a kind of pinkish hue to them, and her lips were open partway, as if she had been buried mid-sentence. But what really had startled the group into silence was this woman's eyes were wide open when they opened up this coffin. It looked like she was looking directly at all of them. And so after a couple of seconds of the silence from seeing this woman for the first time, the townspeople began to cry and scream and back up away from this coffin. And the rival soldiers, they were startled too by this woman's appearance, but they were more angry than anything else, because by finding this woman in this grave, it meant they had not found the general. And so out of frustration, the rival soldiers grabbed this old woman's body, this witch's body, and they pulled her out of her grave, they strung her up to a tree, and they just sat there shooting at her constantly until her body had basically been obliterated by all the bullets. And then finally, when the soldiers stopped shooting, they realized everything had gone quiet. Just a second earlier, the cacophony of these frogs croaking in the pond that had been so loud it was like totally overwhelming had now completely ceased, and it was like the town had gone absolutely still. And this stillness and quietness was so unsettling for these soldiers that they actually just turned and fled right there without saying a word to the townspeople. And then once the soldiers were all gone, the townspeople got to work reburying their dead. And at some point, one of the townspeople jumped into the grave where the witch had been, and when they landed in the dirt at the bottom, their foot actually sunk down an extra foot. They had landed on something hollow and crashed into it. And what it was another coffin. There was another coffin buried below this woman's that the soldiers had not seen. And this secret coffin belonged to General Serkos. When those 6 people had secretly buried General Serkos, they had just placed his coffin at the bottom of an open grave that was about to be filled with somebody else's coffin. They put it in, they covered up his coffin with enough dirt that no one could see it, and then the next day, the townspeople lowered the witch in her coffin into that grave without realizing General Serkos was below it, and then they filled it in, and then they placed a headstone on her grave. But because they thought she was a witch, they decided not to write her name on the headstone. Instead, they just etched a horizontal line across her headstone. And so after this incident with the rival soldiers desecrating this woman's grave and her body, La Musara was never the same. people in the town began dying left and right, and their soil went bad, so they couldn't plant any crops. And then all these insects came through the town, and then all these plagues of illnesses and diseases came through. And so it wasn't long before La Musara had developed this reputation of being cursed. And by the 1950s, that curse apparently had driven the last few people out, officially making it a ghost town. After Jorge wrapped up the story, Anna was just horrified, looking straight down at the ground, because it would turn out the gravestone that she had accidentally knocked over and broken, well, it had a horizontal line etched across the middle of it. It was the witch's headstone. That was the one she had broken. And so suddenly feeling totally spooked, Anna was about to yell to Jorge and Sofia that she wants to leave now, when she happened to glance over at the base of one of the cemetery walls, and she saw the perfect bloody milk cap mushroom, the exact type she knew her husband was looking for. And so Anna walked over, she picked this mushroom, and she turned around to show it to Enrique, but Enrique was not in the cemetery. And so right away, Anna thought, wait, did my husband ever actually follow me back down into the cemetery after I saw him by the church? She couldn't remember. She thought he followed her, but she wasn't sure. And so Anna yelled out for Enrique, but he never called back. And so she turned and looked over at Sofia and Jorge, who she could barely see through the fog. And she asked them, hey, have you seen my husband? Is he in here? Did you see where he went? And they both said, no, we have no idea. And so Anna, who at this point was now really starting to panic because this whole situation in La Musara was getting pretty spooky for her. And so she just dropped the mushroom and took off running out of the cemetery. Now, Sofia and Jorge did not really know what was going on. They didn't understand the urgency that Anna was feeling to find Enrique, and so they saw her take off to go find Enrique, and they just kind of casually walked on after her. And when they turned the corner and they exited the cemetery and began walking basically alongside the church, now again, the visibility is terrible from all this fog, as they moved along, they couldn't see Anna or Enrique, but they could hear Anna calling out for Enrique over and over again. And as they moved, Sofia and Jorge, they would see these shadows moving around in the fog. And they would think it was Enrique or Anna, but as they got up to where these shadows were, there'd be nothing there. And so Sofia, she began grabbing tighter and tighter onto Jorge's arm, and Jorge, who had been kind of joking about how this place was evil, was also now starting to feel a little bit spooked about what was going on. And so they began walking a little bit faster and faster in the direction of Anna's voice. And as Sofia and Jorge got closer and closer to Anna, the sound of the frogs in that pond began to get louder and louder and louder until Jorge and Sofia could barely hear Anna over the sound of these frogs. And then just like that, the frogs stopped. And all Sofia and Jorge could hear was the sound now of Anna crying. Now, Jorge and Sofia could not actually see Anna because of the fog, but they walked in the direction of her voice, and they ultimately found Anna crouched down with her back to them right in the spot where Enrique had previously been standing staring in that church window. And so Sofia and Jorge, they walked up to Anna and they reached down and they put their hands on her shoulder. And when Anna turned around, she was clutching Enrique's wicker basket containing all of his mushrooms. And with tears coming down Anna's eyes, she would say to her friends, "He's gone." Anna, Jorge, and Sofia would spend the next hour searching in vain for Enrique in La Musara. Remember, there's no visibility from the fog, and now it's getting dark, and so it's really hard to conduct a search for someone. And so after this hour was up, even though they had no idea where Enrique was or what happened to him, the friends decided that their best and really only move was to leave and go tell authorities. And when they did that, a massive search was launched all around La Musara for the next week. But despite this huge effort, nobody ever found any trace of Enrique. He just vanished, leaving behind that wicker basket that Anna had found. And so after this week of searching, the authorities finally called it off and told Anna that, most likely her husband must have wandered off and died somewhere, and at some point, hikers will likely discover his body. But Anna could not accept this conclusion, and so she continued to go back to La Musara to look for Enrique. And in January of 1992, so 3 months after Enrique had gone missing, Ana, Sofia, and Jorge returned to La Musara to do another one of these additional searches. And during the search, the friends were walking past the church and they passed by that same window where Enrique had been standing looking inside and also where his basket had been found by Ana. And the three friends, as they passed by, they happened to see into the church, and down on the main floor where the pews used to be and where the pulpit used to be, there were these 6 dark figures wearing robes standing in a circle, not appearing to be doing anything but just standing there. And immediately, Ana actually was really annoyed because she figured this must be a group of ghost hunters that were out here looking for something paranormal, because after Enrique went missing, his story made the news largely because he went missing in a town that's long been regarded as being haunted. And so because of his case, you had all these people coming to La Musara to go find ghosts or find whatever happened to Enrique. And so Ana, who was deeply offended by all these people who were coming out to La Musara to look for ghosts, because for Ana, this is not a game. Her husband really went missing here. So she goes right up to the window to tell these 6 people in robes off, get the hell out of here and have some respect. But when she went to the window and was about to yell in, one of the robed figures suddenly turned and looked up at Ana. And immediately Ana backed up because this clearly was not some ghost hunter. Because the hooded figure had no face. It was just a dark hole looking back up at Ana. But even though there were no eyes, Ana could tell this thing, this entity, was staring right at her. But before Ana, Sofia, or Jorge could react to what they were seeing inside of this church, from behind them, they suddenly heard this unbelievably loud galloping sound, like all these horses were charging towards them. And at the same time, the sound of the frogs in the nearby pond began to get louder and louder and louder. And so Ana, Sofia, and Jorge turned around to see what was going on, kind of expecting to see, a cavalry approaching or something. But there was nothing. All they saw was the fog on the road. And so the 3 friends turned back around to look back into the church. And now these 6 hooded figures were gone. And so suddenly thinking that these figures had left the church and they were coming to get them, the 3 friends did not wait any longer. They turned and just sprinted out of La Musara. Enrique was never found. His wife, his friends, the authorities, they still have no idea what happened to him. There have also been several other people who have gone missing in La Musara, and they too have never been found.
Just before Thanksgiving in November of 1987, 37-year-old Beth Sternlieb stopped to steady herself against a water fountain in a hospital hallway. A slim, strong woman with a bob of blonde hair, she was due to give birth to her second son very soon. The surges of pain were excruciating and growing stronger. Beth's husband, Greg, helped her shuffle along the corridor, trying to distract her in conversation. But the spasms she was experiencing were too intense to ignore. Beth's career as a yoga and meditation teacher at the nearby University of California at Los Angeles had taught her lots of strategies for coping with pain. But childbirth was testing her limits. Greg stroked Beth's hand and suggested she picture a perfect day with their whole family at a beautiful beach in Malibu or maybe a scenic hike in the hills. Beth relaxed a little while visualizing each scene until one powerful contraction scrambled her thoughts. It was so strong, she knew it could only mean one thing. Before she even realized what was happening, Beth was being eased into a wheelchair as Greg and a nurse rushed her down the hall. Everything was a blur of fluorescent lights and gleaming hallway floors until they were pushing through swinging doors into a delivery room. Hours later, drenched in sweat and her muscles aching from furious pushing, Beth suddenly heard the most magical sound, her baby crying. When the doctor finally placed the bundled-up tiny pink infant onto her chest, Beth gazed down at his sweet little face and smiled. All the pain and all the effort had been worth it, and now she was just looking forward to getting some rest. But a couple of weeks later, as Beth slumped in a chair in her doctor's office, she somehow felt even worse than right after delivering her baby. After the birth of her first child a few years ago, Beth had experienced typical postpartum aches and pains, but this time was different. Her primary physician, Dr. Shay Mitchell, listened intently as Beth told him what was going on. For a few days now, her head had throbbed with a dull, deep pain, her muscles ached, and her bowels had been churning. Her entire biological system felt under attack from top to bottom. No matter how many naps she took or how healthy a diet she ate, Beth felt wrecked. Dr. Mitchell nodded as Beth described what she'd been going through. Afterwards, he reviewed her medical chart and the vitals his nurse had taken when Beth first arrived. Then he took a seat on a stool facing Beth and told her not to worry too much. Her recovery from the pregnancy was actually proceeding at a healthy rate. However, he said that, this winter had been one of the worst flu seasons in Los Angeles that Dr. Mitchell had ever seen, so more than likely, Beth had just caught a bug that was a bit more stubborn than usual. And so he advised her to rest as much as she could and to drink lots of fluids. This was traditional advice, but hydration and rest would boost her body's strength to fight off whatever infection was causing her symptoms. If she stuck to this regimen for a while, Dr. Mitchell felt sure that Beth would soon be on the mend. Back at home, Beth told her husband that according to Dr. Mitchell, she very likely had the flu. Greg thought that made sense and offered to cover as much extra childcare as necessary to help his wife get back on her feet. Later that day, once the baby was down for a nap, Greg took their toddler out for a walk in the winter sun, while Beth retreated to the bedroom, closed the curtains, and crawled under the covers. When she woke up a couple of hours later to the sound of Greg and their toddler laughing in the front yard, she already felt better. Beth felt confident that her body would find its way back to health. It just needed time. But one afternoon, 6 months later, after a long shift at the UCLA Meditation Center, Beth felt unusually drained and went to rest in her office. Her postpartum flu-like sickness was long gone, but she'd been feeling run down the past couple of days. Around mid-morning, a headache had crept in and never left. By mid-afternoon, her body felt sore and limp, and she couldn't focus. Sitting in her office chair, Beth rested her head on the desk and rubbed her stomach, trying her best to ease the pain in her gut. As she did, she lifted her shirt and noticed something. A scattering of tiny dots all over her torso. Fortunately, they didn't itch or sting, but they were odd and new, which worried her. Later that night, Beth checked her stomach again before getting into the shower. And to her shock, the dots had multiplied and spread. Now her entire stomach was a solid block of red, like a really bad sunburn. Beth decided it was definitely time to make another appointment with Dr. Mitchell. A few days later, on a hot summer morning, Greg took the morning off of work to watch the baby while Beth went to the clinic. She felt woozy and bleached out by the sun as she crossed the parking lot and marched up the front steps into the building. Once inside of Dr. Mitchell's office, Beth raised her shirt to show him the thick red splotch across her stomach. And under the fluorescent lights, they looked even more severe. Dr. Mitchell studied the rash's texture and traced the tendrils to where it had spread the farthest. After a few moments, he stood back and shook his head. He admitted that he wasn't sure what it was, but his guess was some type of hives, which are usually caused by an allergic reaction. Beth didn't have any specific allergies that she knew of, but Dr. Mitchell told her that allergies can start any time in a person's life, for all sorts of reasons. Dr. Mitchell also said it was possible that Beth might have an autoimmune disease like psoriasis, which can cause severe rashes. He explained that autoimmune diseases are basically like the body having an allergic reaction to itself. Dr. Mitchell wrote down the name and number of a colleague who specialized in autoimmune disorders and gave it to Beth. If anybody could find out what was going on with her skin, it would be him. But unfortunately, it wasn't that simple. Early the next week, Beth made an appointment with the doctor, had blood drawn for multiple tests, then waited several days for a response. But when the call finally came, the doctor had disappointing news. All the tests were inconclusive. He told Beth that her results suggested the presence of some sort of autoimmune disorder, but there was not enough data to determine anything more specific. Beth felt frustrated and tired of this runaround with her health, but the red rash on her stomach had faded, along with the rest of her symptoms. So Beth shrugged it off and refocused on her work and family. Her baby and toddler were growing up quickly, and she wanted to savor every day of it. One spring morning, about 4 years later, Beth's bedroom door burst open as both her kids tumbled onto the bed, hungry for breakfast. Her oldest was in elementary school, and her youngest was almost in kindergarten. Greg play wrestled with both of them as Beth slipped out of bed and went into the kitchen to start the coffee. But as she did, she noticed her head felt hazy. Last night, Greg had arranged a dinner party to celebrate Beth's return from a work trip, so they had stayed up late drinking wine and socializing. Now she felt like she was paying for it. As the coffee brewed, Beth rubbed her temples and pictured the long, busy workday ahead of her. Her kids seemed to have more energy every day, so juggling motherhood with a full-time job was not getting any easier, and having a slight hangover made it even worse. After feeding the kids breakfast, Beth got dressed and went to the bathroom to freshen up. Standing in front of the mirror, something familiar caught her eye. A rash of tiny red dots across her stomach. Beth's heart sank. The rash and the accompanying sickness came back a few times every year. But it had been about 6 months since the last time, so Beth had hoped that this time it might be gone for good. Later that morning, Beth was in the middle of a meditation class when her stomach lurched. She told her students to continue without her, and then she rushed to the bathroom. That day, all her familiar symptoms returned: the headache, the muscular pains, and the cramps. As she drove home through rush hour traffic after work, Beth felt overwhelmed and defeated. All her life, she had considered herself blessed to be a naturally healthy person. But something had changed after her second pregnancy. She still didn't understand what it was, but it was clear that this sickness, whatever it was, wasn't going away anytime soon. That night after dinner, Beth discussed the situation with Greg. She admitted that she had been feeling spread thin lately. The kids required so much energy, and her work had been tougher this semester. But, even so, Beth was confused how stress alone could be responsible for her recurring symptoms. Feeling generally run down was totally normal for any working parent, but pounding headaches and diarrhea and mysterious rashes were not. While Greg washed the dishes, Beth went to their bedroom to meditate. Sitting in the lotus position on her yoga mat with candles lit, Beth tried to block out stressful thoughts. She focused on breathing evenly, letting her body settle into a sense of calm. But worries kept nagging her, that these symptoms would keep coming back forever, and they would get worse as she got older, and maybe one day she'd be too weak and tired to fight them off. Beth gave up on meditation, opened her eyes, blew out the candles, and climbed into bed. Greg came in later and sat next to her. He suggested that Beth call in sick tomorrow and spend the day looking for new doctors. There had to be some medical professional out there who could figure out what was going on with her. Beth was grateful to have such a supportive partner and agreed to Greg's suggestion. But the next day started a trend that would go on for years. Calling various clinics, talking to all sorts of doctors, taking tests, and waiting for results. Yet nobody was able to determine what was causing her symptoms, so her symptoms just kept on returning. Every 5 or 6 months, the illness would return and knock Beth out for a week and then subside. Gradually, Beth learned to coexist with it. She had no other choice. Then came the summer of 2005. One hot day in late August of that year, Beth crouched in the living room surrounded by boxes, helping her son finish packing for college. It felt joyous and surreal, but also sad. Her youngest was now 18 and leaving the next morning to move into his freshman dorm. Beth had intended to go with him and help him get settled, but she'd woken up with an intense fever a few days ago and still felt too weak to make the drive. Her rash had also returned, this time worse than ever, covering her entire torso and up her neck. But it was the fever that really worried her. It had spiked a few times at 104. Beth tossed and turned through the nights, drenched in sweat. During the days, she felt too sick and exhausted to eat and fought to keep her eyes open. She had not been to work even once this week. Beth did visit her most recent doctor, who ran some tests and discovered that her white blood cell count was high, proving she had an infection of some sort. But, as always, he still had no answers as to what was making her sick. Once the boxes were all packed and taped, her son left to go meet up with some friends, and as soon as the door closed, Beth felt her body shut down. She always tried to put on a brave face in front of her kids, but inside, she was losing it. Beth had been battling this sickness for 18 long years. No matter how much she took care of herself or how proactive she was about seeing doctors, nothing had improved. Every 6 months, it came back like clockwork, and now it had returned with a vengeance. Her husband tried to stay optimistic, but she could tell he was beaten down by this too. This was not the life they had imagined together years ago when they started a family. Beth went to the bedroom, drew the blinds, and buried herself in the covers. She tried once again to rest and unwind, but she was getting tired of pretending that things would change. At the back of her mind lurked a dark thought. Was she doomed to live like this forever? 5 months later, Beth was lying on her back in a hospital room, waiting to be slid inside the big white donut of a CT scan machine. The past few months had been Beth's worst yet. Her fatigue had intensified to the point that she had to arrange an indefinite leave of absence from work. Beth's job was her passion, and without it, she fell into a depression, spending entire days in bed or on the couch. She barely ate or left the house. Over a couple of months of this gloomy routine, Beth lost 15 pounds, which only made her weaker. But, despite all this, Beth was still a fighter. She hadn't given up hope of finding someone who could help. Her latest doctor, Dr. William Bruce, specialized in infectious diseases, and over the past month, he tested Beth for a number of possible causes for her sickness, including malaria, parasitic infections, autoimmune diseases, and even HIV and hepatitis. One by one, they were all ruled out. So now, Dr. Bruce had ordered a CT scan to see if Beth might have some sort of internal injury or intrusive growth. Once the CT scan machine was prepared, a nurse slid Beth into the center cavity and then left the room. Beth lay there and listened to the mechanical hum, letting her mind wander. She had been through too much at this point to let her hopes rise very high, but a part of her stayed optimistic. About 15 minutes later, the machine powered down and the nurse returned and wheeled Beth out. A few minutes after that, Dr. Bruce entered and told Beth he would call her with the results as soon as they were ready, most likely in a day or two. The next 48 hours seemed to crawl by until finally, early one afternoon, while Beth sat on the couch under a blanket, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Her CT scan results had come in. Beth listened tensely as a nurse explained that the doctor had discovered 8 fibroids in her uterus. Now, by itself, that was not so shocking. Small uterine fibroids are common in women over 40, and they're very rarely cancerous. But one of Beth's fibroids was abnormally large, which could spell trouble. Fibroids tend to swell when they lose their blood supply and begin to die, which can lead to complications. The hospital gave Beth the phone number of a gynecologist, Dr. Jessica Schneider. They recommended that she call Dr. Schneider first thing in the morning to treat the issue. Beth promised she would, hung up, and went to tell her husband. Beth wasn't sure what to make of all this news yet, but she couldn't help but feel optimistic about the discovery. Was this really it? Was this the source of 18 years of sickness? Later that week, Dr. Jessica Schneider sat across from Beth in her office and told her she would need surgery. Beth nodded slowly with a look of resignation, like she'd somehow been expecting this. This was Dr. Schneider's third consultation with Beth. Over the course of their meetings, she had grown fond of her patient. Despite Beth's soft-spoken manner, she was clearly tough and resilient. Even so, this illness had obviously taken a toll. Beth's warm smile looked tired, and her eyes were ringed with dark circles. Dr. Schneider didn't want to add to Beth's struggles, but she knew surgery was a must. Over her years as a gynecologist, she had encountered fibroids many times and knew what to watch out for. When fibroids die, they often get big very quickly, and there was always a chance that any of Beth's fibroids could be cancerous. Dr. Schneider booked Beth's surgery for a couple weeks away in December and warned Beth that it was possible the fibroids were not the cause of all her sickness. If so, the surgery wouldn't change anything, but it was worth a shot. After the surgery, once Beth was stitched up and wheeled out of the operating room, Dr. Schneider scooted her stool in front of a stainless steel surgical tray and looked down upon the largest fibroid she had ever seen in her career. It was about the size of a grapefruit, 4 inches across. Dr. Schneider shook her head in shock as she thought of Beth carrying that enormous thing around inside of her. Poking it with her surgical ruler, Dr. Schneider was surprised by the fibroid's consistency. Normally, fibroids are dense, like little balls of muscle. This one was strangely springy and swollen. Dr. Schneider picked up a scalpel from her surgeon's toolkit and gently pressed the blade into the flesh of the fibroid. As soon as the tip pierced the skin, white pus exploded onto her hand. Slicing deeper, Dr. Schneider could not believe what she was seeing. The fibroid was like a rotten dumpling, filled to the brim with infected liquid. In all her years of study and practice, Dr. Schneider had never seen or heard of a fibroid like this. She quickly placed it in a sterile container and then hurried to have it tested by the lab. Dr. Schneider didn't know for sure, but every medical instinct in her body pointed the same direction. Whatever it was in this giant fibroid had to be the thing that had been making Beth sick. Days later, Dr. Schneider's phone rang with the report she had been waiting for, and with it, the explanation for Beth's long illness. Beth's fibroid was not cancerous, but it had been incredibly bad for her. The pus inside of Beth's fibroid was absolutely teeming with an unidentified strain of Salmonella bacteria. And, as far as the lab could tell, this Salmonella had been festering inside of Beth for a long time. Possibly as far back as 1987, when Beth gave birth to her second child. For 18 years, Beth had been suffering from a simmering Salmonella infection that sometimes boiled over and caused her terrible cramps, rashes, and all the other debilitating symptoms. With the source of the infection removed, Beth's body could finally recover. Now, only one final question remained. How had she contracted the bacteria? Several months later, Beth was at home when there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find a public health nurse bearing unusual news. The hospital had kept testing the Salmonella from Beth's fibroid, searching for a match, until they finally found one. Hers was not the Salmonella commonly found in contaminated or undercooked food, but instead was a Salmonella strain only found in reptiles. Beth was blown away. Her kids had never once owned a pet reptile, and as far as she knew, there had never been a reptile in their house before. She had no idea how anyone in her family would have even been around one. Though Beth never got an official explanation for how she caught this reptilian strain of Salmonella, her doctors suspected that she contracted it while in the hospital for the birth of her second child. All it would have taken is one employee or patient with a pet turtle or frog or lizard who didn't properly wash their hands to touch something that Beth later touched as well. A doorknob, a railing, a water fountain. After that, the disease took shelter in a uterine fibroid where it would periodically escape into her bloodstream, causing her repeated bouts of illness. After her surgery, Beth never suffered from another episode of her terrible rash or other symptoms ever again. She returned to teaching mindfulness and yoga full-time with a deeper appreciation for health than ever before.
From Ballin Studios and Wondery, this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballin. A quick note about our stories. They are all inspired by true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved. And a reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Britt Brown. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Andre Plus. Our senior managing producer is Nick Ryan, and our coordinating producer is Taylor Sniffen. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Teja Palakonda. Fact-checking was done